Okay, so we're good to get started. We're on the hour mark. Thanks a lot, guys, for joining. And for everyone that's kind of like tuning in, we're going to be talking about Carta's highly scalable permission system. It's called AuthZ, and it's based on the Google Zanzibar paper. But before we kind of like dive into the technical details, I would like to ask, what does Carta do for anyone in the audience that might not know, and what do you guys do specifically at Carta?
Yeah, so Carta is a private fintech company, and we really aim to provide liquidity in the private sector. So, before Carta, you used to have to work at a company for maybe 10 years with the hope of someday going public. But we have several products like tender offers where if your company is on Carta, you have your cap table on Carta, you can actually sell shares through a tender offer to investors. So you can get liquidity before the company actually goes public. And we have several other products as well. We focus primarily on cap table management software initially and valuations for companies, but we're expanding to other markets like employee compensation data, fund administration for VCs, investors, as well as capital markets.
Okay,
And
so it
sorry.
seems again, like without getting into the weeds, including myself, I'm not a financial expert. You handle a lot of information about private companies, equity structure, who has equity, who has specific rights, grants. So a lot of important financial data, kind of like to summarize and simplify. Does that make sense?
Yes, exactly.
Good. And what do you and Andy do at Carta? I imagine it's a large company. What team are you on, and what does your team do?
Yeah, so our overall organization is platform infrastructure. So we're actually on the IAM team, which is Identity Access Management, as I'm sure you know. So we focus primarily on authentication and authorization, and we also handle user data. On the side, we kind of help out with some other stuff like gRPC frameworks, logging occasionally, and just like general infrastructure. But yeah, my primary focus is on IAM.
Good. So this is kind of like one of the topics, and that keeps kind of like recurring in the Twitter Spaces show. Let's say we talk a lot with platform teams, or at least one of the platform teams at different companies, because what we're looking at is how they build authorization for other internal teams inside the company. Now let's kind of like start getting into the meat here. Again, we talked about the team working on a platform, identity and access management, but let's talk about authorization. Quickly, kind of like describe what you see as authorization at Carta, and why is authorization and why are permissions important at a company like Carta?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people confuse authentication with authorization. So authentication is basically validating the user. So given some user credentials, is this correspond to a user, and get user data. But authorization is more does the user have access to something in the system? So inherently, because Carta deals with a lot of sensitive financial information, be very bad for business if we leak any of that information to competitors or allow unauthorized users to transfer data, between different companies. So we need to make sure that a user is properly authorized to do what they should be able to do within the system. And also, with the financial data, you also have to be compliant. So it's important that we're able to audit who was given that access at a certain time. And even if the permissions, have changed since then, what were those permissions at this specific time? So yeah, there's a lot of requirements there, but we were able to, fulfill all of those with AuthZ.
Okay, so it seems that like kind of there are a couple of aspects there. One of them is authorization, what the user can do. And then there is another one that is more around like the auditing, what happened in the past. Oh, just I think Aaron, can you mute while I'm chatting because I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Not sure if you. Okay, yeah, there we go. Thank you. So there's kind of like authorization, and then there's auditing, what happened in the past. Can we go into like maybe one specific use case of like what you authorize. So for example, this user should be able to do this, shouldn't be able to do this. And the same thing for auditing. What use cases for in terms of compliance do you need to be able to show auditors?
Yeah, for sure. So Carta is a network of different user types. And what I mean by that is you have companies and you have employees, but there's also a bunch of different users that are on our platform in addition to those. So a company has a bunch of employees, but then you also have VCs which are on the platform, which invest in companies. And then you have people called VCs or venture capitalists. Then you have people called LPs, which are limited partners, and they provide capitals for venture capitalists to invest in companies. And so, LP might be invested in multiple VCs, and then VCs might be invested in multiple companies, and an employee might change the company that they work at. So you can see how it's a network or a graph of users. And so through each of these edges, there are different ways that somebody could be authorized to view like cap table data, for instance, as part of a company. And to make things even more complicated, some VCs might have funds that invest in companies, but they might also have funds that are composed of other funds which invest in companies. So it's like this nested relationship of fund to company mapping. So through, yeah, like I said, through these different edges, you can have access to different things like security or cap tables or documents. And so our permission system needs to handle all of those cases. And we need to be able to identify who was able to access that data. And also we need to give companies access or the ability to limit the access that the VC or the LP has on their company's cap table as well.
Okay, that makes sense. So essentially, if I work at the venture capitalist or at a limited partner, for example, at a limited partner, I should be able to see how my funds from the VC are allocated, but an employee at the company should not be able to see that view and so on. That makes
Exactly.
a lot of sense. Now, before you built AuthZ, you had a working implementation of authorization. What were the issues that you were seeing with that implementation?
Our initial implementation was very focused on our cap table business, and it consisted of a data model that we created using Django models and Postgres. And so it was very tailored to that specific product. But over time, we've acquired more employees. We've built many more products, and the company's been growing really quickly. So we've had to update that model and add more features. Over time, it became overloaded with lots of different things, and it works. It's pretty hard to update because there's a lot of testing involved, and sometimes we need to make big changes in order for it to handle the new products. So we were really looking for something that was more generic and easier to update. And so as we expand into new markets, build new products, we can just push permissions into a new system and not have to worry about building a bespoke data model specifically for that product. Especially if we can leverage.
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat that? I accidentally muted everyone while I unmuted myself.
Yeah, sure. What did you miss?
So the last part is so it's essentially about enabling the business to build new products without changing everything. So like a more generic model. And then you said especially when.
Oh yeah, especially when we're building new products and we don't want a team to build bespoke business or bespoke permissions models.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So one of the things that's kind of like happening is that like product proliferation, right? You have different, not necessarily permission models because some of the entities are related, but different authorization criteria for different products. And there's kind of like this notion of business agility and making sure that as new products come in, you can quickly onboard them, but also retain a lot of the benefits of what you built before. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
Good. And so what were kind of like, again, we talked about the goals with that implementation, but like what were how did you pick those goals, right? Because it's very easy, like when we get started, at least as engineers, to say, hey, yeah, we're going to build for scale and microservices, and it's going to be decoupled and flexible. But like, from a business perspective, what was the pain of having to go through these painful upgrades, of having to go through kind of like the lots of testing to make changes? What were the business outcomes of all of those issues?
At Carta, we're all about creating leverage. And so leverage is different in efficiency, where efficiency is like if I put in the same amount of work, can I get the output easier? Versus leverage is if I put in less work, can I create more output? Um, and so we want to create leverage so that teams don't have to put in more work in order to get something done. We want to make it less work. We want to utilize the same products for multiple teams. So really, to us, we wanted to build something at the infrastructural level that people could use, not have to worry about, and just have it work, right? And we didn't want them to have to create these like bespoke data models specifically for their products. So we're really looking for something that was super generic that we could use. And when we started, we actually had a couple businesses that hadn't been spun up yet, and we had use cases for their permissions. And so we took those use cases and we looked at different options for various permission systems and used those use cases to figure out if that system would work even before we built it.
Okay, and what options? That's kind of like good segue into my at least planned next question, which is like, what options did you see out there? I recently, I've been working on authorization for almost kind of like a year, just dedicated to that, and been looking at the market. Recently, the presentation about it, and there's kind of like a proliferation of open source tools, and like some vendors, some of them are SaaS vendors, some of them are like more like maybe infrastructure-ish vendors. What did you see out there?
Yeah, so when we looked, it was mid 2019. So it might have changed since then. I honestly haven't looked since we started building. But at the time, there was OPA, Open Policy Agent, and that looked pretty cool, but it kind of solved a different problem. So OPA is like the system that you run on top of not on top of your service, but separate from your service, which handles authorization. It basically executes policies, and the data for those policies could be stored on the system that runs OPA, or it could reach out to an external system to get data as well. But basically, it would separate the authorization layer from the service itself, which solves a different use case that we were trying to solve. We were just trying to make something that was flexible and faster than what we had. And so we decided not to go that route because it didn't fix the data problem. We also looked into potentially rebuilding our model, but the model had been rebuilt a few times, and it just really wasn't working for us. Each time we rebuilt it, it took a lot of effort, a lot of testing. Didn't really want to go down that route because we figured there'd probably be stuff down the line that we hadn't thought of, and things would probably have to change again. So we decided not to go that route. What we did in the short term, because at the same time we were also decomposing we had a monolith, we decomposed into microservices. We decided to have the short-term solution where we created distributed tokens with permissions. But there were some power users that had, lots of permission. Like, say you're a LP that has access to lots of funds, you could have lots of permissions for all the companies that exist in all those funds. So tokens could become bloated, and we thought that it probably wouldn't be a good idea to use that because we wouldn't want our power users to experience, slower response times. And then we thought about also going a role-based approach as well, but we just couldn't get the fine-grained permissions out of that because it's just too generic. We wanted to build products that we could create different abstractions for, where you could have like specific access to a single entity, like a document or a security. And the old system was more focused on role-based. So there's a collection of a bunch of different permissions that existed under that role, and it was hard to create new roles. So if we went the role-based route, we felt like we would further limit ourselves into these all-encompassing roles, and it would be harder to build finer-grained controls on that data.
Yeah, that makes sense, and again, that's kind of like one of the things that we've been both thinking about as we build kind of our Zanzibar as a service, but at the same time talking to both prospects and people here at the Twitter space. You mentioned a couple of interesting concepts that, again, maybe not everyone is familiar with, so I'd like to kind of like double click on those. One of them is like the notion of like finer grained permissions and like access to a single entity. So how do you think about like role-based access control in comparison to that fine-grained single entity access?
Yeah, so role-based is it's more like I guess it's a role, but it's not a single permission. So you can think of it as like, are you a company viewer? Are you a company admin? Are you a document editor? It's just a role that might apply to some companies that you have access to, but it doesn't give you fine-grained permissions on specific entities that belong to that company. And the other thing too about that is when you have role-based checks within your logic of your code, it's a lot harder. Basically, the logic becomes more complicated because you also have to query a bunch of other data to figure out what access the user has. So for instance, if I wanted to create a new group of documents and give a user access to those documents, I'd probably have to create a separate data model where my document viewer role would first give me access to that, and then I have to query a separate data source to figure out if the user belongs to a certain group of documents. With the fine-grained permissions, you can basically apply permissions to single entities, like a single document. So if I want to give you access to a specific document, I can do that. I don't have to give you access to a role. But I can also create abstractions that group a bunch of single fine-grained permissions together. So maybe I can create a group for staff documents where all the users that are a staff user of a specific organization can see all the staff documents. So yeah, we just basically wanted something that was more flexible, and so we didn't have to roll all of our own custom app logic to fire off those permission checks.
Yeah.
Andy, I don't know if you had anything else to add about that too.
Yeah, just regarding role-based. Roles are great when they're predefined and you know exactly what permissions are set on them. But there are use cases where a company may not want the 8 pre-canned roles, but create their own roles that have like their own custom permissions on it. Once you go down that, like, if it's just purely role-based, you will get sort of a role explosion where you will have literally thousands of roles in your system. And we really wanted to avoid that. We wanted to give our users the ability to create essentially custom roles, but not create like just a role like mess in our system. And I don't know if I explained that right, but essentially, if you just have a role-based system and you need to grant permissions to very specific entities, roles grow out of control very rapidly.
Right. Yeah. This is kind of like, because this is kind of like this finer grain notion is I would say, I won't say newer term, or although you can argue that also like attribute-based access control with policies does allow this kind of finer grained access. There's a difference between I can access a document because of like specific attributes that the document and I might have versus I can access a document because someone specifically granted me access to that specific document. And it's not about me and it's not about the document. It's about like that kind of like sharing, that connection, that access. And my other thought there is the notion of the role doesn't necessarily disappear, right? Like you could have a role for a particular document. I'm going to make something up. You could be a writer or an editor of the document, and that just means a number of permissions on the document. So as an editor, you can write the document, you can view the document, you can share the document. All of those could still be roles and permissions, but you don't have to create the editor for document 1, editor for document 2, editor for document 1000 role, which kind of like goes back to that role explosion that you were talking about, Andy.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. So again, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm good.
Good. So what we talked about again, kind of like these alternatives. When we go kind of like another thing that you mentioned was like the notion of like bundling things in the token. Before we kind of like dive into Zanzibar and how you kind of like found it and thought, hey, this is it. Can we talk about that token alternative? Again, what's a token? What do you put in it? How do you eat a token?
Yeah, so the token was more of an experiment than anything. We wanted to prevent the problem of services overriding permissions in a distributed environment, and not propagating that data to other services properly. So basically, like a consistency problem. So we created what we called it's a JOT token, if you're familiar with that. But we created a JOT token that embedded all of the permissions that a user had. And so usually when you have permissions tokens like this, you'll scope them to different entities. So like if you belong to two corporations, maybe you'd have a different scope per corporation. The problem though is because we have this really complex relation between like all the user types in the graph, you could potentially see data like in different views on the app for like multiple companies. So we couldn't really split the token up by scopes. And the way the old legacy system worked, I don't want to get into it too much, but the way the old legacy system worked, you kind of had to look up like all of the permissions within a specific fund in order to get like to show the fund. And so we ended up having to build these huge tokens with like pretty much all of the permissions so that we could pass them to the upstream services in the transaction. And so, yeah, it just didn't really work. We never went to production with it. We were just experimenting with it. But yeah, I mean, I think for any sort of like super complicated use case, like for us, it just didn't really work. Andy, I don't know if you had anything else to add about that, but.
No, I think you got most of it. Just to reiterate, like, yeah, it was an experiment, and I think the problem came with our power users. Same example Aaron gave with LPs. Like, you have some LPs that had like access to maybe hundreds of funds, and to generate that JOT, it was very time consuming, and we did not want to put that latency on to that power user. So that's sort of what shied us away from using this JOT.
Yes, that makes sense. And just kind of like for anyone out there that's not familiar, so a JOT, a JSON Web Token, is a JSON embedded, or like kind of like a JSON embedded credential. So it's an assertion where you take JSON, you encode it, you sign it, and then basically you can verify that the signature hasn't changed based on like the key that was used to sign the token. And because of the signature, if you trust the entity that issued the token or that signed it, you can also say, hey, I'm going to trust the contents of that token, so you can decode the JSON and you can check the attributes. And we actually did a very good episode on that with Vittorio Bertocci. He works at AuthZ, where we talked about kind of like the profile for access tokens and JSON Web Tokens for Auth2, which again, I recommend to anyone that's kind of like interested in that topic. So again, we talked about tokens, we talked about fine grain. Let's dig into Zanzibar, right? The blog post is about, hey, at Carta, we built a custom implementation of Zanzibar. One of the jokes I have is like that Zanzibar, it's so hot right now, quote from Zulander. Everyone's building a Zanzibar implementation. What made you pick Zanzibar?
It was kind of lucky that we found the white paper, because like pretty much exactly at the time that we were looking into building a new system, the Zanzibar white paper was released. I believe it was like mid 2019, if I remember correctly. But anyways,
yeah, I think it was July or August 2019. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that was like exactly when we were building it, and so it kind of fell into our laps. If anybody doesn't know, Zanzibar is Google's highly scalable permission system. I believe they use it for some of their big name products like Drive and Gmail, and there's a few other that I'm forgetting right now. But yeah, so they release this white paper, and they use it to define ACLs or access control lists in order to create permissions. But the cool thing about it is there's two things. One is that you can create nested groups of permissions or abstractions of permissions, kind of like roles, but they can be nested, meaning you can compose them of other things. So it's similar to like Unix file permissions where you can give access to a specific entity, but again, you can create groups on top of that bundle these things together. And then they also have a index system which makes lookups on those permissions extremely quickly. It doesn't matter how many nested groups that you have, the lookup time is basically constant. So that to us was very impressive, coupled with the fact that it was proven to work at scale. It just seemed like the right thing to pursue. So I mentioned earlier that we had a list of use cases that we were given from some products that we were planning on building. So before we even started building the system, we just looked at the concept of a relation tuple, which exists in the Zanzibar paper, and use relation tuples to build these access control lists. And we modeled out some permissions to figure out if the system would actually work for us, and if we could potentially update it if things change and things like that. And we found that for every use case that we were given, we were able to create a model that would work in this system. So from there, we decided to go forward with Zanzibar.
That's great, and it reminds me a lot of kind of like my experience trying to kind of like validate Zanzibar. So I'm trying to kind of like think of it more from a SaaS perspective. Is this something that companies would use? In your case, it's kind of like the same, right? But it's an internal SaaS, and the fact that of going out there and getting real use cases and trying to model them and saying, hey, does this work? Does this work? It's kind of like the test-driven development for kind of like product acceptance criteria, so to speak.
Oh, definitely. And I think people start, like, especially engineers, we start building stuff way too early. And I think we lose a lot of time by doing that, because a lot of things you can test before you even build anything, and you gain a lot of valuable insight into how to build the product. I have a blog post about AuthZ. I talk about this a little bit, but yeah, I think it's really, really a great thing to do.
Good. So again, we covered a bit on Zanzibar, and I'm really hoping that again that we'll do an episode on the just Zanzibar at Google once. But you guys aren't Google, or at least not yet. I want to learn about like your architecture, right? Like how does this system work? So let's walk through kind of like a couple of use cases. One of them is what happens when you need to like perform an action with the API or like render a web page, and how are permissions checked? And then kind of like the other part of that, how does the system store things, like kind of like a high level view for anyone that kind of like is listening and try to create a mental picture of what's going on.
Yeah, so I released a blog post actually on Friday about AuthZ system architecture. I go way more in depth in that blog post, so I recommend you check it out. It's on medium/building-carta.
Yeah, and we'll link to it in the YouTube notes as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'd recommend reading that, but I can give you a high-level overview. So the system's written in Python and Postgres, and we use Postgres as the database. We chose that because we had tooling already built for Python and Postgres. We might update to some other data store at some point, or rewrite it in a different language if we're seeing problems. But so far, it's been, our metrics have been really amazing. So I think for now, we'll just keep it as is. But yeah, so we have a service, a gRPC service that's written in Python, stores data in Postgres, and then we have a Redis instance which controls our workers, and our workers are used to process updates and push them into the index. So a consumer will hit AuthZ and push a relation tuple that I mentioned earlier. A relation tuple is kind of like an entry in an ACL, access control list. It defines a actor that has access to an object through what we call the relation. And so they'll push the permission update into AuthZ. AuthZ will store that data in a append-only commit history. And so it could be an add or remove if you want to change a permission. And then we fire off a index update event, which basically traverses the graph and pre-computes paths in the graph for the permissions. So like, for instance, there might be a couple nested groups between me and a permission. Say I'm a admin of a group, and if you're an admin of a group, you're also the editor of a group of documents. And maybe if you're editor of a group of documents, you can edit document number 1 or something like that. So there, you can see that through these groups, there's a path in the graph. So when you check access in AuthZ, you provide input, can user 1 view document 7? And through those groups, you're given access to a specific entity. And so to do that lookup on a commit history, it's very time consuming because you would have to traverse the graph. So it's expensive. So what Zanzibar does and what we do as well is we build a secondary index which stores pre-computed paths, and not the full pre-computed path, but smaller subsets of the pre-computed path, and those are built through our Redis workers. So when the change process happens, it fires off an event. Worker will update the index, and then that's all happens async. So as soon as somebody adds a permission to AuthZ, we return, and then the index updates are processed offline. Then a consumer could come in and check access. If the index update has been updated in our secondary store, then we query that and return the permission to the user. So it's probably too much to kind of go over in this format, but I definitely recommend reading that article about how it works. I go very in depth about all of this.
Great. So that's awesome, and thanks for kind of diving into that. I'll try to kind of add a couple of notes, and having read the blog post and having worked on a system like this, maybe to kind of help color some of these things, and again hoping that you, Andy, and Aaron kind of add anything that I might not have gotten right. So the way, again, a Zanzibar-like system works is you store what's called as a relationship tuple, and that defines a relationship that an actor or a user, for example, has to an object. For example, that can be user Damian is a writer. That's a relation of document authorization. And that's kind of a fact in the system. It's stored with those 3 parameters, right? The actor, the relation, and the object. Now, what I understand is you send an RPC, right, with these 3 parameters. Python server takes that and stores that into a Postgres database. Is that a Postgres database that you run? Are you running any cloud provider flavor like Aurora? How does that work?
So we just have a lot of tooling built for Postgres. So we use AWS. We have all our tooling there. We use RDS actually. So it's just an instance that was provisioned by our infrastructure team.
Okay, makes sense. And is that kind of a single region cluster? How many AZs does that run? Or is that a multi-region cluster?
I don't know if I can go into it too much, but
that's okay. We can skip over that. That's good. So again, we store the data in Postgres, and then we store this data using kind of an append-only format. So it's either an add of the relation tuple or a delete of the relation tuple. That has the data there. Now, one of the things that you notice, and it's also in the paper, is that it is possible, because of the flexibility of the system, because of the composability of the system, to have really nested groups. So someone might have a particular relation to an object because, as we said earlier, it's a limited partner that has a bunch of funds, and those funds might actually be composite funds that have access to other funds. So that level of nesting and access means that in order to guarantee very low latency, and we can get into why that's important, you need to kind of unnest and flatten this whole structure, and that's why you end up building that secondary index with the workers. Does that make sense?
Exactly.
Okay, and so I think the final thing there is, it seems that this index is kind of eventually consistent with the Postgres database. What were the trade-offs that you considered as you made that decision of keeping that system eventually consistent?
Yeah, so I mean, it just makes the response times a little bit better if you're adding permissions. Since it might take a while to pre-compute the paths, we don't want to make the consumer wait for those updates to happen. We just want it to be fire and forget. So you fire an update, we say, okay, we'll eventually be consistent. Here's a token that you can use to query our system later. Zanzibar calls this the Zookie. And you can continue doing whatever you're doing. But when you check the permission, pass that token in order to verify that your updates have been made to the permissions graph. And so you don't have to pass that token, but if you don't, it's just like it could be the most recent version of the index. It's not guaranteed that your permission will be in there. So generally, we recommend that consumers pass this token.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's basically like you're giving back this token that says kind of like, when I ask for new data, make sure that anything that I wrote in the previous request, which was again in this case a write, is already considered in the response. Does that make sense?
Yep. And we do this mainly from a user perspective. We don't want people to just have to click a button and wait for their permissions to update. We want the UI to be fast. And so if all this stuff processes offline, it's just a much better user experience.
That makes sense. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, like, it's better for the system too, because we're not CPU constrained on the actual service. We let the workers handle that offline, right? And those are the things that we can spin up tons of replicas, and we don't really care about how much CPU we use, right? So the service still stays reliable and quick.
Makes sense. So one of the things I'm hearing is again latency and performance and responsiveness. Before we dive into like the technical details of that, what is important about those characteristics for Carta? Like how do you quantify the business impact of that speed?
Andy, do you want to handle this one, or do you want me to take it? Andy?
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I did not hear anything. I got.
Oh, looks like he's having connection issues.
Yeah.
I can handle this one. So initially, I don't think the performance was actually a huge deal for us. We wanted to be faster than the old system, but like it wasn't top of mind when we were building the new system. Like primarily, we wanted flexibility and a system that we could build new products on. It's great, however, that we found a system that also has performance, because we've seen pretty significant performance improvements in our product just by using this. And I'll get into it a little bit when we talk about flatten, but the fact that we can grab a list of all the entities that a user can access in under 20 milliseconds is just an amazing user experience. And it makes the product so much faster. So we're really excited about that.
That's great. Yeah, that is one of the things that kind of like goes back to the thing you kind of mentioned earlier, which is other alternatives like OPA today, they don't handle the data. And a big part of latency is data indirectly, right? Like there's this need to make sure that the data source is reliable and it's fast and it's indexed and implemented appropriately. And when you have, again, very large monoliths or you're evolving a microservices architecture, you typically do that where you optimize for the write path, or like again the CQRS pattern with the write path and the read path. This is the same thing, right? This is a very heavy read path for authorization, and indirectly what you're doing is kind of like having your authorization microservice that's optimized for that.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that we benefit from too is that it's a single source of truth. So there's no services that might have like similar permissions that you don't know which one to query. Like it's all in one system, and you can even connect permissions across domains too if you want. So it's just been really amazing to have everything as a single source of truth, which is consistent.
Good. So let's kind of like flip our view now. Like we are kind of like putting our builder hat on, and hey, how does this work? But we started the conversation with Aaron and they work on the platform team at Carta, on the IAM team, and what they do is they build tools for other developers at Carta to use their services to make their lives easier. How did you validate that what you were building was useful for teams?
So if you've ever read the book called The Lean Startup, the guy talks about this build, measure, learn feedback loop that he uses to build a company. And so the build, measure, learn feedback loop is you build something, you measure how successful it was. And when you build it, you don't build anything that's complete. You just build a proof of concept. You measure how successful was it. You learn from those metrics, and then you build something else that optimizes on what you had earlier. So at Carta, we build a lot of our products using that same philosophy, even if they're just internal products. So we use that philosophy to build AuthZ. And like I mentioned earlier, we started by not even building a product. We just modeled permissions out and saw for ourselves, what worked and what didn't. So once we were confident that Zanzibar would work from our perspective, we built a super simple MVP that didn't have any performance optimizations. It didn't have the index. There's only like 3 endpoints that you could use. You could add permissions, you could remove them, and you could check them. We didn't have visualizers or flattened algorithms or anything like that. And then we distribute it to some teams just internally, nothing external. And we had them spin up our service in a test environment where they could model some permissions and test to see if they worked. And so from that, we got a lot of positive feedback. People really liked the way you modeled permissions, but there were a few things that they didn't like as well. One is that it was slow, because whenever somebody added a permission, we'd had to, whenever somebody checked the permission, we'd had to traverse the graph. It was difficult to add permissions as well because there's only one endpoint to do it. So if you had like 100 different permissions that you need to add for a corporation that's created or something, you would have to call AuthZ 100 times to add all those permissions. So that wasn't great. And then there's no visibility into the system. So once you push the permissions, you couldn't visualize like what the graph looked like or what you had added. So obviously room for improvement. We took that information and then we built several different iterations where we addressed each one of their problems step by step. And sometimes people didn't feel like our solution actually solved their problem, so we backtracked and we built something else. And through that process, we built something that works really, really well for our company. And every new product has used AuthZ, and it's been extremely valuable for them, created a lot of leverage. So yeah, I would highly recommend using that approach.
That's interesting. We kind of like did a very similar thing. We actually kind of like built an initial version of this kind of like the Zanzibar, and then we went show it to people and kind of like doing similar things. So you mentioned a lot of these things, like the ability to visualize things, that it was slow. You mentioned the notion of like, what if I need to do lots of permissions, and also the notion of flatten. Can we talk about each of this? Like, for example, let's talk with like, how did you solve the case for like adding lots of permissions?
Yeah, so we have several different endpoints to do this. gRPC methods, I guess you could call them, because we use gRPC. But we have bulk adds, so you can add permission. Like you could just post a bunch of different relation tuples and with the bulk add method, and then it would add everything. But something that we've been using recently is the template, like adding permissions through templates. And templates are basically a way to add repeatable permission sets. So you define a template in AuthZ which corresponds to a use case, let's say. So say our use case is let's create a new fund. And so whenever you create a new fund, you're probably going to have to add several different permissions for the groups that you have by default for that fund, maybe for the entities that fund can access, or the users that have access to that fund. And so the templates have they're using mustache syntax, so you can inject variables, you can have loops and conditionals. And consumers will inject data for that new fund into the template and call AuthZ. So whenever something happens on the change event, they would call AuthZ with a template, pass in the data for the newly created entity, and then it would just autofill AuthZ with all of the data. And this has been really helpful for our consumers because there's kind of like one source of truth for how they update the template as well. It might change at some point, but it's been very easy for consumers to call AuthZ with those. And Andy, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that as well.
Can you hear me this time?
Yep, we can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so as Aaron said, those are the two main methods, but we've noticed like an uptick because we are keeping like analytics on this, and templates for the most part are heavily used. When new services spin up, it's really easy for them to define their templates. And like Aaron said, if it's like creating a corporation, creating whatever it may be, all they have to do is hit this one endpoint, and that sort of that subgraph is automatically generated for them. So it's a very consistent way for them to create their graphs in their workflow. And it's, I think, probably one of the most heavily used endpoints at this point. Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but except for check. But this is for adding, has been heavily used, is the template endpoint.
I think you're muted.
Oh no, I agree with Andy. Yeah, I mean it's heavily used, and it makes testing really easy too because because there's one template per use case, it's all defined there. And so if you need to ever look at how do we add permissions for this thing, you can look at the template for that. It also prevents people from fat fingering permissions. So if I was to create a script to add permissions for something, if I added the wrong relation tuple, it could mess up my graph. But if it's done through a template, you can test that the template renders the correct permissions for that entity.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like it's a very thin layer on top of the Meta API to write or bulk write tuples, but it gives you kind of like a lot more safety and reusability without having to worry about that. And I think that the key thing is not just that again you went and like got that feedback and built it, but also you have metrics about like how often the feature is used, and that's again the typical thing what you do when thinking about products, but not something that you always see when you have platform teams selling or building a product internally, right? What about like the other concepts here? What about like, for example, the visualization that we mentioned earlier? What was the feedback that kind of like led you to say, hey, like we have no visibility into the system. We would like to know what's going on.
Yeah, so at first we introduced some endpoints to read permissions or like query AuthZ for relation tuples given some filters. But it's really hard to visualize how the graph is structured based on a list of results that you receive from AuthZ when you call like the read endpoint or the query endpoint. Read basically just goes down one level. So if you say read a list of permissions that this user has, it just gives you all the direct connections from the user. So what are all the permissions that were directly assigned to the user, or what are all the groups that they belong to? And the query, like I said, the query it just gets a list of relation tuples based on some filters. So consumers were having a hard time like visualizing what was in the graph based off of those things. And at the same time, when we were actually testing AuthZ, we were testing our index build system, and we thought it'd be easier to create a graph viz of the graph that was created for our tests, so we could figure out all the connections and then write unit tests to, integration tests to verify that all the connections were properly pre-computed. And so we thought, why don't we just expose something like we built for the testing with GraphViz to our consumers? And that's what we ended up doing. We built a tool in this web app we call Concord, which is used internally, where you can pass in an actor or a group, actor being like a user or service or something like that. Group is like a group of users or services, and you can visualize all of the connections that that particular entity has, and then you can click into downstream connections for those entities as well. And the tool is still actually pretty primitive. It shows downstream and upstream permissions, but we plan to have other things like query by timestamp, so you can see a history of what permissions a particular user might have. And we also plan on adding filters, so we can pre-expand the graph, but only include the things that are filtered by. But I mean, that alone has really sold some of our consumers on the usefulness of AuthZ, because before it, like even before we had AuthZ, we didn't have much visibility into the system unless we created scripts to query the data. So it's been really helpful, especially for our support team, to look at those permissions.
Just to add to that, one of the other nice things is it's almost an auditing ability where you may have a user and you're wondering why do they have permission to some entity. Allowing you to visualize the path on how it's determining it has permissions is very helpful. So you may see like, hey, this person was like added to this group here, and this group was added to a different group, and that's why they have this permission now to view this entity. If it is just a straight list of relation tuples, it's very hard to determine that. So that visual tool is just very helpful for auditing purposes.
That makes sense, and we do see that like having that full graph is important, right? One of the things that you see, for example, when you look at Google, is that when you click share, you just see the users that were kind of like added directly to a particular Google Drive document, and you also see kind of like the groups, right? Everyone in an organization has access, but like there's nothing in the middle. So, for example, if you're sharing a document with a group of people, which you can't today, you wouldn't be able to see that with that list, because you wouldn't know, okay, everyone who's a member of that group and so on. So kind of like that deeper tree visualization is very useful. What are the advantages that you've seen from having a global store for permissions rather than like having different teams do their own thing?
Like I meant, well, Andy, do you want to answer this one? I've been answering a lot of them, so I don't know if you want to answer it.
Sure. So one of the biggest advantage, of course, is there's like one source of truth. As we decompose into multiple services, what we would hate to see is every single service having to spin up their own permission system. Because when it came to auditing or trying to figure out permissions, trying to aggregate all those permissions would be a nightmare. So having that one source of truth that is just a large graph is extraordinarily helpful. And as Aaron hinted on, like other questions or previous questions, the ability to connect these different services permissions together is extraordinarily powerful. So if you wanted to know like everything a user has permission to in the system, you can actually query AuthZ and get that. So all the companies or corporations they have access to, all the funds, all the whatever it may be. So having it in one place is very helpful. And then it's, as Aaron hinted, it creates a lot of leverage for us because all our consumers of AuthZ, they don't have to create their own permission systems. They just use this platform specific one. It's the same across all teams. So if people do move teams or they join teams, there's just one system to learn. And it's very consistent in how it's being used. So everyone sort of knows how to use permissions across the company.
Good. Yeah, those sound extremely useful. The notion of like, again, educating anyone, or if you just transfer teams, one of these very big cross-cutting concerns is already implemented for you, so you don't have to worry about it. It's one of the great things about kind of like building internal platforms. Now, again, lots of teams using this, lots of use cases. What are like the current numbers from the system in terms of like RPS that it handles? The latency, like maybe some of the percentiles, because I know you mentioned some of these numbers. Can you share more concrete numbers or give us a notion of like ballpark?
Yeah, I can take this one. So Yeah, we did a lot of load testing before we even pushed it out to production. And so when we were doing our load testing, we made sure that there were basically no duplicates that were, looked up when we hit the endpoints. And we were still, even with that, no duplicates, no caching, we were able to get about 6 to 8 milliseconds at the P95. And even at the P95 is about 12 to 15 milliseconds. And this is just because in the index, every permission, or sorry, actor and object relation type that we look up, we hit a key. So it's basically a constant lookup, and you're only constrained by the round trip time to your Postgres instance, which in our case is in the same data center. So it's pretty fast. When we started pushing it out to production, we got even better latency because sometimes consumers would call with the same permissions. And then we actually introduced SDK, which had more caching on the client side. So even better performance to the user. So we're pretty happy with that. The only thing that I would say has kind of slipped a little bit is we've been encouraging. So the original metrics were based on not passing a token, or a Zuki, as Zanzibar calls it. And so it would just use the most recent version of the index. But we've been encouraging teams to pass a Zuki now, which is that change token. Again, it's returned with a permission when you add a permission or remove a permission. And so with the Zuki, it's been the P50 is more like 10 milliseconds, and P95 is between 25 and 30, I'd say. But we think that with some more caching, we could probably improve that.
Those are. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to add on the load testing. We've built pretty deep graphs and pretty wide graphs as well for this. So, I mean, some of our tests, we had 100 level deep graphs that were, 20 to 30 nodes wide, and we were still getting these response times. So it wasn't just like the simple, like 2 or 3 node graph. These were literally hundreds of nodes in this graph that we were testing against.
And how does that fare, not just as the nesting changes, but like as the RPS goes up or down?
So go ahead, Andy.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, we currently have 30 RPS in production, and we've load tested to over 150 on just a couple nodes. I think we're more constrained by the DB at this point, because we can just spin up as many services as we want. But I mean, we're still getting really good performance. We've never had to scale up the DB even for over 100 RPS, and we're using a T2 Postgres instance. So I mean, pretty small instance for what we're doing. So yeah, I've been extremely impressed by how this has performed.
Good, and let's talk a bit about the rollout, right? This was, as I can imagine, a large, important change across different teams. How did you roll all of this out while trying to minimize risk?
Andy, do you want to take this?
Yeah, so I could take a stab at this. So, I mean, AuthZ has been adopted by any new products that are coming out. Generally, will go on this. So that was a very easy thing for them to just sort of switch over and use AuthZ from the start. In terms of our current permissions, we're still moving on some of the older legacy permissions on there, but there is a process of moving people over slowly. And there's different strategies on what we're taking just to verify the new system and the old system are giving me the same results. So in some cases, we may sort of dual write to both systems and check and just verify over some time to verify, the same permission checks are being done correctly. We're going as slowly as possible just to be methodical about this to make sure we don't create any new bugs or any permissions that aren't supposed to be there. So it's just been a slow process of migrating over current permissions over into the new system. But like I said, what we do to verify is basically we will dual write to both systems, the old system and the new system, and all our checks, we verify that the answer is the same. And we do this for an extended period before we say, okay, it's good, and we actually flip over to the new system and stop the dual writes.
Yeah, that sounds very common, but I think everyone that I've talked to that also is kind of pushing out the Zanzibar implementations, going through the same kind of dual write, shadow read, comparison, making sure that the results are the expected ones, progressively ramping up the load, and also onboarding new teams first. So that sounds great, actually. it's always good to hear kind of like these repetitive patterns. On the one hand, like it's a problem because of confirmation bias, but at the same time, it's like, hey, yeah, this works, and not just at one or two places, but at many places. Kind of like to close things up, and again, it's been great, and I learned a bunch of things from this. What are kind of like the things that your key learnings from this whole endeavor? And I would like to kind of like pick your brains on each of you, maybe one or two things.
Andy, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think the biggest key learning here is experimenting. So again, Aaron talked about this, but building an MVP, I think, really helped us iterate very quickly on this and help us build a product that's actually useful for Carta. And it's not just reiterating or iterating very quickly on this, it's actually going to teams who are using this and getting their feedback, incorporating that into the next version. And I guess this could be applied at any engineering or any system, but it's a very important thing to take away from this. Just create an MVP, iterate on it, and get feedback as quickly as possible. Because the more feedback you get, the better the solution will be for the company at large.
And just to add on to that, I think building things in a modular way where you can swap out components with better implementations later on has been super helpful. Like just having the index as a separate system that we can replace with whatever we want, maybe a different database, or maybe a different set of workers would build it with lambdas or something. I don't know. But, anyway, having a separate modular system, like broken apart in different pieces, has been super useful. And also just like building the system without thinking about performance at first and then optimizing later. Like there's that quote that's like, optimization is the root of all evil, or something like that.
It's
I feel like that's
premature optimization is the root of
yeah, exactly. Apologies for not remembering that correctly,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think if we would have just tried to optimize before even delivering anything to our customers, like our internal customers, I guess, I think we wouldn't have rolled out a solution as quickly as we did and provided value for products at a time like right before they needed to be built, which was super critical for us.
That's great. Yeah, that's kind of like one of the challenges that kind of like you always face, which is like how much is enough, right? Where you can go validate something and you can only kind of like get feedback so many times from people, at least the same people, especially at the company. So like what's the minimum set that you can build so that they will be interested, but at the same time not make it too small so that they don't see the value in it. And that's kind of like a very fine line to walk, but kind of the biggest challenge in building a new product, probably. Good. So again, like this has been great, guys, and again, I really love having you on. We're going to be publishing the recording to YouTube channel probably either tomorrow or on Friday for anyone that kind of like joined the space a bit after we started it. But again, we really appreciate it, and kind of like a sneak peek of what we're doing next week. So next week we will actually have the folks from Styra, also OPA co-creators as guests, and we'll be talking about all things OPA, Rigo, and Styra. So if you're interested in that topic, again, anyone that's listening in, you should tune in. This should be next week. I think it was at 3 p.m. PDT, but I need to confirm the time. Thanks a lot.